Hey folks, Tim Newman with Softlight Studios bringing you another Mastering Photoshop video. In today's video, we are going to start our multi-part series on Photoshop's Move Tool. Now, it seems hard to imagine that you would need a multi-part series on the Move Tool, but under the covers, the Move Tool is incredibly powerful, and I think learning it inside and out would serve every Photoshop user well. Let's take a look. In this multi-part series, we are going to explore in depth Photoshop's Move Tool. Now, as the name implies, Photoshop's Move Tool is the ideal tool for moving around selections, layers, and even objects within a Photoshop document. However, what the name doesn't imply is the collection of not necessarily hidden, but certainly not in your face operations that the Move Tool is capable of performing. So we are going to break this series down into multiple videos. And in this first video, we are going to have an introduction to the Move Tool and its basic operations. In our second video, we will take a look at all of the additional operations that the Move Tool is capable of performing, and then we will have a collection of videos that demonstrates those additional operations in depth. And I think it's appropriate that we spend this kind of time with the Move Tool, because if you become an accomplished Photoshop editor, the Move Tool is going to be among the top 5 or at least top 10 tools that you go to on a regular and repeated basis. Let's go ahead and get started with our introduction to the Move Tool. Now in Photoshop, unless you have reconfigured the default toolbar, the Move Tool exists right here at the top of the toolbar. And as you can see by hovering over it, I get this handy little video that has become the standard in the newer version of Photoshop. Yet this video really belies the true power that's here within this tool. Now, as you'll notice, as I hover over this tool, there is a little triangle in the lower right-hand corner indicating that multiple tools live here. And if I click on this triangle, I get the toolbar flyout for that tool position. And as you can see, not only does the Move Tool live here in this spot, but so does the Artboard tool. And they both have the same V shortcut key, or if you haven't reconfigured your preferences in Photoshop, a Shift V shortcut key. Now, as you continue to hit V or Shift V, you will cycle through these tools in this toolbar location. So you want to make sure that you don't get the Artboard tool by mistake, but rather you get the Move Tool as you see indicated here by this icon with the 4 arrows pointing off of the center. Once we have that tool selected and we move out here into our document, you can see the default icon that comes along with the Move Tool in the shape of this little arrow with the 4-sided Move Tool icon being displayed right below it. One thing I want to point out here before we move on, and I am sure this is still the case, but it is worth noting just so everybody can be sure, you will notice up here in the Tool Options bar that there is a feature here called Show Transform Controls. And for years, by default, Adobe has installed the product with this check mark turned off, which honestly makes no sense to me because, quite frankly, without being able to see the transform controls, it's really hard to see where the Move Tool is about to take effect. So you want to click and turn that on, and by and large, I can't think of any situations where I have subsequently turned those transform controls back off. And what this will cause Photoshop to do whenever you select the Move Tool is whatever selection, layer, or object is currently in focus, the transform controls and boundaries will then display around that said object. Now, I know what you're thinking at the moment. Hey, Tim, we just turned the Show Transform Controls on and nothing happened. I don't see any transform controls here within this Photoshop document. You know what? You're right. And here's why. Because the layer that's currently active, if we look over here in the Layers Control panel, is the background layer. And you will notice that this background layer is locked. Background layers in Photoshop that are locked cannot be edited or moved. So in order for our transform controls to be visible, we would need to simply unlock that background layer by clicking on its unlock icon. And you'll notice immediately we have transform controls showing around that layer. If I subsequently decide that I would like to relock this background layer so that no edits can be performed to it, I can simply come up here to the lock section of the Layers Control panel, press the lock all icon as you see me doing here, and that background layer is now locked again. You'll also note that the transform control handles that were bounding the edge of this layer are gone again. Now let's say that I come up here and I make this upper image layer active and I turn off the lock on that layer. Immediately you will note that we have transform controls again, but they're not in the same location as they were with the previous layer. They are now just bounding that upper image area. And the way that the move tool determines this boundary is on the basis of the transparent border that is around this particular layer. If I come up here and I turn off our two text layers and I turn off our background layer down here, you'll notice that now we just have the upper image layer itself visible, and you can now see clearly why the transform controls have chosen to place themselves where they are. It is on the basis of that transparency that is bordering the image on all four sides. Now, one of the things that's important to note here is that our transform controls don't appear to be including the border that's going around the four edges of the image and the drop shadow that we're seeing here to the lower right. And that is in fact because those elements are being provided by this layer effect style right here, in which we have specified a stroke and a drop shadow to be displayed. These aren't actually pixels contained on that layer. These are pixels generated in real time by that layer effect style. And so the transform control does not include them, even though you'll note if we move this layer around, those layer effect styles successfully move with it. I'm going to go ahead and put my layer back where it was. And last but not least, I'm going to close out the display of this layer effect so it's not taking up so much room in my layers control panel. And in fact, I am going to relock this upper image layer here and then turn back on my background layer and my two layers of text. Before we go too much further in exploring the move tool, I do want to explain to you my layers that exist in my layers control panel and my generic approach to editing within Photoshop, because I think it'll explain what you're seeing over here to the right. As a matter of course, when I have an image, or in this case, a couple of images here that I've layered together, I want to make sure that my work with those images is non-destructive, i.e., I can't accidentally do something that would damage one of those images permanently that I couldn't undo. And a lot of folks rely upon the history layer as their undo mechanism, which is fine while Photoshop is active. But the minute that you save Photoshop, or heaven forbid Photoshop crashes and you have to recover from a file, that history stack is gone, and any edit that you might have been in midstream with is now a permanent edit that you cannot easily undo. And in fact, some cases I'd say they're quite destructive. If I unlock this layer, came over here, grabbed the paintbrush and did a giant blue streak across here, well, that's now a permanent edit on that layer, not undoable. And quite frankly, if I saved this and I came back into this, I doubt that I could rebuild the missing stone and striations here in the geology that we're seeing. So this image would in fact at that point be a loss. So I'm going to undo this real quickly and come back here to this unlock state, and I'm going to put the lock all back on so these are both locked, and I'm going to explain to you what you're seeing here. This layer here, which I just made active, is a copy of this layer here. And if we turn it on, you will notice that it becomes visible and in fact blocks all the layers below it because it is indeed 100% opaque. So it is blocking everything below it. And then again, I come up here one more layer and I turn this layer on. You can see that it is in fact blocking the image underneath it, except where transparency exists in the layer. And the combination of the two of them are blocking everything down here in these two layers. So what I have done here is I've made a copy of this layer to here and a copy of this layer to here. And these are the images that I will be doing my edits on. If I have an edit here that I just simply can't stand, or even come back into Photoshop later and go, oh, what was I thinking now that I see that again? I can simply take these guys and drag them into the trash. And my originals are still there in the background and protected. I'm going to go ahead and put those back real quickly because we're going to use them for a couple of other examples. Now that we have adequately covered the concept of making copies of image layers within your document and then using these copies as the layers that you're actually going to edit and keeping the originals locked so that you have an undo path for potentially destructive editing operations, I think it's a good time to look at two more subtle features that exist within the Move tool that I would hazard to guess the vast majority of Photoshop users are unaware of. So the first such feature is up here in the tool option bar, and it's this auto select feature that I am hovering over right here. And if I turn this on and you watch the layers control panel while I am clicking in various areas within the document, you can see as I click on some of the text layers and I click on the upper image and the lower image, various layers within Photoshop are automatically becoming active. Now, about the only time I use this feature is when I am working on a document that has a large number of text layers and a very specific graphic layout that I'm working on. And maybe I'm trying to align those text layers with one another or move them around or what have you within the context of the document. But by and large, I'm doing a lot of work with those text layers, and being able to quickly select them by clicking on them is a lot faster than working our way over to the layer control panel every time I want to switch a text layer. On the other hand, if I'm working on a composite document that has a number of composite layers to them, and some of those composite layers have a high percentage of transparency, then I'm less likely to use the auto select tool, because sometimes transparency will cause that auto select feature to read through to a layer below and select a layer that you weren't intending to select, and that can be a little bit frustrating. The other feature I want you to know about here is if I have the Move tool active, which I do right now, and anywhere within the document I right click, you will notice that I get this little context sensitive pop-up list. And this context sensitive pop-up list has a number of layers within the document that I can select from here. So you'll notice that each time I bring up this list and I click on one of these guys, I'm going to that layer within the layers control panel, and Photoshop's making it active for the Move tool. It's making that layer actually the active layer. Well, that's all well and good. The only issue that I have with that, and we'll right click on this one more time so you can see it, there are no graphic layers represented within this list. I don't see any of my text layers here, and in other exercises that I've tried with this, I don't see any layers that contain vector objects. It's just simply, from my point of view, a list of all of the bitmapped layers that exist within the document. I would love to see this list expanded out to include all the layers, and in fact even the groups that might be over in the layers control panel. I think that would be way handier. Then I could see myself using this all the time and avoiding ever driving the mouse all the way over to the layers control panel to activate and select a layer. The other thing that I do want to point out here, while we've got this little pop-up list displaying here in the middle of the screen, I think this really underscores the importance of renaming your layers when you create them in Photoshop. Don't just go with the default layer 1, layer 2, layer 3 labels that Photoshop provides you. Either create your layers in such a way that you name them when you're creating them, or at the very least, double click on the name in the layer strip later and give it a name that makes sense to you when you see it pop up later, or you're looking at the layers control panel later. It makes it a lot easier to navigate through your document and, quite frankly, edit faster. To demonstrate some of the features of the basic move tool without going to any of the advanced operations that are within the tool, we're going to make sure that we have the upper image copy as our active layer over here. And then we're going to look over here in the middle of the document and note that, in fact, around this frame here, we do have our transform control showing, indicating that we're ready to use the move tool and do some transforms to this layer here that is active. Now, at its simplest, the move tool allows me to just click anywhere in the middle of the transform control boundaries and take this particular layer, in this case with transparency around it in the borders, and drag it around anywhere I want within the boundaries of the image. In fact, outside the boundaries of the image as well, if I would like to. So I have a lot of control in moving that around. You'll notice also as we're moving this, smart guides are popping up along the way. Those are those magenta colored guides that kind of keep coming and going as I move. So here on the left, we have a smart guide indicating that we're butting up right against the boundary for that text block on the left. And you can see if I move to the right, I get that same boundary indicator over here. You'll also notice if I kind of slowly come to the center, you'll notice that we kind of snap to the center, and then if you look at the little pop-up status indicator there in the middle, you'll notice that it is indicating that on the vertical axis here, we are at the 0 point with the center of the content that we're currently moving here. And as we move downward, you can see that display update, and then before too long, we get another smart guide indicating that we have in fact snapped the center of this content to the center image boundaries here. So this selection that we're moving around here, or this layer that we're moving around here, is now exactly centered top to bottom and left to right, which is way handy. Back in the day, we used to move our center points, draw guides, draw edges around things, snap them to all of those points. The smart guides are a real blessing in my mind, and very, very handy. In addition to being able to grab this layer and drag it around on the screen, we can also come up here to the control handles and hover over them. And you'll notice as we hover over various different control handles, we get little icons that pop up here. And if we get close to control handles, we get yet again more icons that pop up here. So dividing these up generically, there are 4 corner control handles and 4 edge control handles, and we're going to treat those separately because they do behave separately with the tool. If I come over here and hover right over any one of the corner control handles, and I mean right on top of it, you will notice that I get what Photoshop calls the scale icon. And that's because it allows us to click on this and hold. So we're essentially doing a drag operation here, and we are scaling this selection upwards or downwards in size. Now, I'll caution you, scale is not without penalty. Scaling downwards is not a big deal, but scaling upwards, if you scale up percentage-wise a lot, you're going to start to see rasterization and pixelization in your image, because you're basically taking a finite number of pixels and saying, hey, I want you to occupy a larger area in the document. Photoshop, as soon as it sees that, says, oh, by cubic interpolation, we need to make up some new pixels to go in those openings or spaces that have been created, and that's where you start to see the breakdown of the image. So you got some latitude in resizing, but it's not an unlimited latitude. Got to keep an eye on that. Now, you'll notice here that as I'm scaling this up and down, I still haven't let go with the mouse. I'm just dragging this in and out. That no matter whether I drag more up or more to the right here, both sides of this area are scaling in a aspect ratio constrained way, meaning that if this block here in the center was 3:2 at this size, it's still 3:2 at this size. Up until the most recent release of Photoshop, this was not the behavior that you got out of the scaling operation. You had a a free scaling operation in terms of aspect ratio, and you could stretch upwards or sideways at will. You can still do that, but what you need to do now is hold down the shift modifier key, and you'll notice as soon as you hold down the shift modifier key, well, then movements up and down, left and right, do rescale the area and remap the aspect ratio here. As soon as I let go of that shift key, we are going to snap right back to what the original aspect ratio was before I started doing this scaling operation. Another modifier key that's really handy here, and it would be the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows, allows us when we are scaling to scale from the center of the area or object that we're scaling. So you can see we're working our way back into the center here, and we are always working our way out from the center as we are scaling this up with that Option/Alt modifier key being used. And interestingly enough, if I combine that Option key on the Mac, Alt key on Windows modifier key with the Shift key, not only do I get that scaling from the center, but I also unlock that aspect ratio constraint, so I can scale outwards evenly in all directions and say, you know what, while I'm doing that, I'd like to make this more of a panorama look than a 3:2 look, for example. So when you're using these modifier keys, the one thing that you want to make sure that you always do is let go of the mouse first, let go of the modifier keys second, so it doesn't undo the effect that those modifier keys were having at that moment in time. The edge controls on a area that is actively being moved allow us to take that edge and move it in and out. Now, with the new changes to Photoshop, that edge expansion is aspect ratio constrained. So you can see as I'm bringing this edge up here, which is what I intended to do, is just drag it upwards, that left and right edges are expanding as well. And I can tell you, after having used Photoshop for a number of years, this change was a little frustrating. But again, the Shift modifier key is the key that unlocks that aspect ratio constraint on an edge. And then, of course, if you add in that Option key on the Mac or Alt key on Windows, it unlocks it in both directions while keeping the aspect ratio constraint unlocked. So this is a great way to stretch it out up and down. And if I let go with the mouse, let go with the modifier keys, and then go to a side edge and do the same thing, you'll see we get that same aspect ratio constraint. Shift key to unlock the aspect ratio constraint, and Option key on the Mac, Alt key on Windows to unlock, taking this and stretching it from the center. And combining both gets rid of the aspect ratio constraint and allows us to stretch outward left and right while leaving the top and bottom alone. Again, let go of the mouse first, modifier keys second. So really, the transform control handles all the way around the document, in combination with the Option key/Alt key and the Shift key, are the modifier keys that allow the tool to do all of these different things. All right. And then last but not least, if I come up here outside a control handle in a corner, you'll notice I get this kind of bent icon, and that indicates that we have the ability to rotate that edge there real quickly. Now you'll notice that the layer effect style got a little squirrely during the rotation, kind of separated out there. And I'm not sure that that would happen on every machine. It's probably a component of the graphics card that's in the machine, but theoretically it should redraw itself correctly. Now that may not always be the case. We'll see. Okay, one last thing here. I've done a lot of things here. I've taken this thing and I've stretched it outwards in all four directions. I've stretched it up and down and left and right, and I've rotated it. Now I have a choice to make, and that choice is, am I keeping these changes or am I getting rid of them? If I come up here and hit this check mark, that will commit my transformation. I don't have to come up here and hit that check mark though. I can simply, from down here in the document, hit the Enter or Return key, and it will go ahead and commit those changes. You will also note that that really funny edge that had a problem redrawing from the layer effect style went away, and the layer effect is drawn correctly. So it's really more of a display issue than a functional issue within the program. The other thing I want you to note here real quickly is our transform edges are no longer at the edges of the content. They are in their entirety bounding the content, but you'll notice that where there are diagonal edges there, that the transform edges don't just match up to those diagonal edges. The transform edges are always going to be a square at least, or a rectangle, one of the two. There are no transform edges with a move tool that are anything other than square or rectangular. So you can expect to see that, and that indicates that that this transform is going to occupy moving any visible pixels within those transform boundaries. One other thing here before we wrap up with the discussion on this these transform controls, and that is, if you didn't want to commit your changes, if you had changed your mind in the middle of all that, you could have simply hit the escape key, and that would have put the selection, the layer, or the object back in the state it was before you started any of the transform control moves. So you have that as an option. You can either hit enter to commit the transformations that you have dialed in, or you can hit escape to back them back out. Because we haven't saved the document and we still have our history panel over here, I can simply go back a step in history and I'm back to where I started as well. So there's another mechanism for backing out of the transform changes that you have made. One last concept here I want to cover, and then we will wrap this introductory video up, and that is the concept of selecting multiple layers at the same time. So I'm going to come over here to the Layers Control panel on the Mac. I'm going to hold down the Command key, that's the Control key on Windows, and I'm going to click on another layer. And you can see that we now have two active layer strips over here, indicating that both of these layers are in fact actively selected. And you will note that our transform controls have moved to the outside edge of the two edges of these images. Now, it's hard to tell that both of them are selected, but they indeed are, and the way that we know that is because both of the channel strips are lit up. Now, if I come in here and use the move tool, you will notice that I'm moving both the image copy and the upper image copy at the same time. My transform control operations like scaling and changing aspect ratio and coming in uniformly all work using the modifier keys that we've already learned in the same way that they did before. It's just that multiple images or multiple selections or multiple layers are all getting done at the same time, depending on what is the active selection state, if you will. One last thing that I want to show you here, and that is the same thing works if we have a group. So I'm just going to right click here on these layer strips. I'm going to say group from layers right here. We won't even give it a name. We'll just go with the default group 1, which I know I told you never to do, but that's what we're going to do. And you will notice that if I have a group selected, I get that same control ability, except now I don't have to individually select the layers. It's every layer that is within the active group that now becomes the target of the transform control. So I can grab selections, layers, objects individually. I can grab layers in a multiple layer selection, or I can grab a group and everything within that group will be selected automatically. In fact, I can even select multiple groups if they exist, and the transform will happen to every layer that's within all of the selected groups. I'll meet you on camera here in a few seconds. We'll have a quick wrap up and then we will have you out of here. Well, there you have it, folks. Some of the power of Photoshop's Move tool in our first video in this multi-part series on the tool. Hope this video provided you with some useful insights, and I hope you'll tune in for the rest of the videos in this series. I think you'll find it quite informative and helpful in your Photoshop editing efforts. As always, we appreciate you tuning in here at Softlight Studios. If you want more of the goodness that we're bringing you in video fashion, please click on that subscribe button down there below. We look forward to seeing you back here again soon. If not, we look forward to being out there shooting in the field with you. Remember, as we always say, learning equals skills. Practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.